great at it. Ambassador Yalowitz was a career Foreign Service officer from 1966 to 2001. He served twice as U.S. ambassador to the Republic of Belarus and Georgia. His other overseas assignments included Moscow, twice a glutton for punishment, I might add, including in 1991, at the time of the breakup of the USSR. He also served in The Hague and with the U.S. mission to NATO in Brussels. Those are rewards. Following his retirement from the Department of State, Ambassador Yalowitz taught graduate courses at Georgetown University, dealing with Russia's conflict with its South Caucasus neighbors. From 2003 to 2012, he directed the Dickey Center for International Understanding at Dartmouth College. And during that time, he co-taught courses on authoritarianism and democracy in the former USSR and the politics of language in South Caucasus. He returned to Georgetown, where he served as director of conflict resolution, the conflict resolution MA program. And after that, remained there as an adjunct professor. He has most recently started teaching at Virginia Tech as an adjunct. His op-eds or articles have appeared in major publications: New York Times, Washington Post, International Herald Tribune, Christian Science Monitor, National Interests, and so forth. Politico, Newsweek, the Moscow Times, among others. And he's interviewed and quoted frequently. He follows national security and environmental issues in the Arctic. And we planned to have Ken open our spring climate change symposium, which we thought was going to be April 2020, but as I'm sure you'll understand, we had to cancel it because of the pandemic. So Ken, welcome back to the Santa Fe World Affairs Forum. It's been too long a time.
Thank you very, very much, Pat and Krista and Steve. It's a pleasure to see you, Pat. We go back a number of years, back to Foreign Service days, and it's always a pleasure to see you. I enjoyed so much my previous trip to New Mexico, and you folks, I know it's hay fever season, but you live in a beautiful part of the world, and I'm kind of envious. I wish in a way that I'd been able to give this talk, 2 years ago, because things have changed radically, really in the last 5 or 6 weeks. And so I'm going to talk about, what is going on in the Arctic. But keep in mind, there are sort of 3 significant crises, going on right now simultaneously. COVID, and COVID is a serious issue, in Alaska, particularly with Native peoples, indigenous peoples. Ukraine, obviously a very significant crisis, and the climate change. All of these are going on, and they are so serious. I think it's really not inaccurate to talk about them as existential crises. I'm going to focus on the Arctic. And in talking about the Arctic, I'm going to focus on 2 aspects, 2 key things that we are following very closely in the Arctic. One is climate change. The impact of climate change is being felt dramatically, in the Arctic. And the other is geopolitics, and how geopolitics, is now influencing what is going on in the Arctic. And when I talk about the Arctic, I'm going to really divide it into 3 stages, 3 time periods. And I promise that this is the end of the math, that I'm going to throw at everybody. So it's 3, 2, and 3. I'm going to talk about, to start with, the Arctic, primarily just a bit before the end of the Cold War. If people recall in the audience, during the Cold War, there was a lot of activity over the Arctic and under the Arctic. And that meant between the United States and the Soviet Union. There were air flights, over the Arctic. There were submarines that were playing dangerous games of tag, in the Arctic. The key point, though, is that the Arctic was not the focal point. We were not fighting over the Arctic. The crux of the Cold War was U.S.-Soviet, competition. But it just, probably the best word to use in a really nasty sense, it was a playground, for a lot of military and related activities. And then when the Soviet Union broke up in 1991, there were some very important developments just before the breakup of the Soviet Union that broke this model. And if you remember, Gorbachev was the president of the Soviet Union, and he made a very important speech. I believe it was in Vladivostok at the end of the 1980s. And what he talked about was that we should now make the Arctic a zone of peace, that there were significant, scientific, health-related, environmental aspects about the Arctic that really required cooperation and not, a continuation, of Cold War attitudes. And in a way, what he was arguing in certain respects was like what had been decided with the Antarctic years before. The Antarctic has been reserved as a zone of peace, cooperation, and scientific research, by treaties that have lasted since the Eisenhower days as president of the United States. And what Gorbachev was basically proposing was that the Arctic should also be, a zone of peace, to open the door to cooperation, and that the idea was that the Arctic should be a zone outside of, political competition, outside of geopolitics. And that was a sort of the halcyon period, the early 1990s after the breakup. In 1996, the Arctic Council was created. The Arctic Council is the most important intergovernmental body, in the Arctic. It is not formally an international organization. It is a group of 8 countries, 5 of which are Arctic coastal states: the United States, Canada, Russia, Norway, and Denmark. And Denmark, because of Greenland, is an Arctic coastal state. In addition, there are 3 other countries that were founding members: Sweden, Finland, and Iceland, obviously all at the top of the world, and all, with a very strong interest in what was going on in the Arctic. What was unusual about this organization is that it's based exclusively on consensus. All, agreements have to be agreed upon, but they are not really binding, on the governments. It's really up to each government to implement the decision, that is being made. There are now also 18 observer nations, as part of the Arctic Council. That was a development that began, I say, about 8 or 10 years ago, and now China is an observer, and I'll be talking about China more. And there's another feature of the Arctic Council that's very important, and that is that indigenous people have a seat at the table. There are a number of indigenous peoples groups that are represented at the Arctic Council and actually sit, at the table. And the sort of the most important work done by the Arctic Council is it established a number of working groups. And these deal with the subject of most concern to the Arctic Council. That is scientific cooperation and environmental, cooperation. The whole idea was to promote sustainable development in the North in an environmentally, conscious fashion. And keep in mind, that the Arctic is very different from the Antarctic in one very important sense. The Antarctic has no population. There are scientific bases there, but the Arctic has population. Each of the countries that I mentioned, has people, living in the Arctic. And the largest populations, of course, would be Alaska, Canada, and Russia. Also Norway too. Greenland has a very small population. The population of Greenland can probably fit into a suburb of, any major U.S. city. It's a huge piece of land, but not many, not many people there at all. So another important point to keep in mind is that when this organization was created, these were the halcyon days after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when we had these very optimistic viewpoints about what the world was going to look like now that the Soviet Union was gone, that we were going to have Europe whole and free, that everybody was going to be focused on democracy building, that the whole idea of military security and military activity was sort of put in the background. And we, the United States, made a big point that the Arctic Council would not take up hard security issues. Those were beyond the purview of the Arctic Council. And that was done for two reasons. One, the atmosphere, seemed very peaceable at that point. And two, we were concerned that there not be any sort of contradiction or friction with NATO. NATO, remained our key security alliance. So the Arctic Council, was doing a lot of very, very important work, on the Arctic. What we began to see, though, as you get into the new century, the 21st century, that the significance of the Arctic became much more prominent. One obviously factor is, one of the two factors that I talked about was climate change. Arctic scientists for a long time, have been talking about climate change. I can remember being in Alaska, must have been close to 20 years ago. And they took us from Juneau to see one of the glaciers. And everybody was pointing out, see this rock and all this stuff here, that used to be covered, by the glacier. And about a half mile away, you could still see the glacier, but you could see, where the glacier, had receded. And that was really the first indication, the first introduction I had to global warming. And I said, what's causing this? And the people, of course, said, human activity. This is a result of what we are doing, to the atmosphere. So the Arctic, there was a lot more attention that was beginning to be paid to it because of climate change. And that's where you hear that lovely term about the Arctic being the canary, in the coal mine. And I'm not a scientist, but the scientists that I work with at Dartmouth on climate change in the Arctic all explained to me that the impact of climate change was being felt first, in Alaska, being further, to the north. And some of the examples, and I've been up in the Arctic many, many times in many different places. And everything I'm going to describe, I have actually seen, myself. I've seen, the impact of rising water levels. In Alaska, there are villages, coastal villages that have literally fallen into the sea, because of erosion, because of, rising levels, of water. There is melting of the permafrost, and I saw this flying from the United States into Nuuk, the capital of Greenland, and you can see, where the ice is there, and then the line of sort of like just pebbles and rock, as I described up in Alaska, where the ice is receding. So the permafrost is melting, and there is a very significant byproduct to that, which we're finding primarily in Russia, and that is, as the permafrost melts, methane is being released. And some of that is from organic matter that's just been buried away for centuries, and being revealed as the permafrost melts. The weather extremes, obviously, which we're seeing now, in the lower 48, you certainly see those, up in Alaska. The wildfires, the crazy temperatures. I can remember one of the very first villages that I visited up in Alaska, people telling us, how sad it was that elders, who knew ice, they could go out on the ice, for hunting, whatever it was. Now the elders could not predict, how thick the ice was, and people were drowning, whereas, people had been experts in the thickness of the ice. Now they were going out and dying because they couldn't predict anymore, what the ice was like, underneath their feet. There were also diseases moving north, believe it or not. We heard of malaria, up in Alaska. And you've had, I talked about COVID, but diseases, have come up, into the far north. The Arctic Ocean fish supplies, which are very important, they have also been impacted by global warming, because what is happening is fish stocks, which were accustomed to the frigid conditions, are having to move further north now, to get into areas where the sea ice might not have melted. And that has impacted the fish stocks in the Arctic. So, and there's another aspect too. They're very strong human impacts as well from climate change. When I was at Dartmouth, we had a whole series of conferences on the Arctic, the various aspects of climate change, and one was on health. And I've already mentioned, the presence of diseases that had never been there before, but amongst the Inuits, amongst the native people, incredibly high rates of alcoholism, mental illness, and suicide. And a lot of that was directly related to the change in lifestyle. In Greenland, in Nuuk, the capital, they had built a number of apartment houses, basically for people who no longer could live, on the land in the same way. And as I looked at those, apartment buildings, many of them, had skis, they had, antlers. You could see that these were people, who were living, in cities, but their hearts, were elsewhere. Their way of life, was elsewhere. And these problems of suicide, mental illness, and alcoholism are almost at epidemic level. Now, there were not always all negative aspects, though, of climate change. These were the things, that we were noticing as very evident aspects. As the sea ice was melting and the temperatures were warming up, it meant that the possibility of sea routes, across the north, connecting, the Atlantic and the Pacific, those were dreams of 100 years ago, and some ill-fated, naval expeditions, that those might now be realized. And in fact, they have to a certain degree. And then the second thing was easier access to the vast oil and gas reserves in the Arctic. roughly 10% of the sort of undiscovered oil reserves in the world in oil are in the Arctic, and about 30% of the gas, and a lot of that gas, is in Russia. But, despite all this happening, we did not observe any significant, issues about borders or who owns what. And that is because there is the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which was adopted about 40 years ago. And under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, each coastal country has what is called an exclusive economic zone, which goes out 200 miles, from their coast. And in that zone, they have, sort of first rights to the fish, any resources, in the water, but also on the coastal floor. So if there is oil or gas to be found, within those 200 nautical miles, it belongs to the coastal state. And so there have not been any, real crises, any conflicts over who owns what, in the Arctic in terms of the exploitable oil and gas reserves. There is an issue now, though, and it will be in the future, and that is the Arctic Ocean. The waters go out way beyond these 200 nautical miles, coastal miles, and that is the issue. There is oil and gas probably on the floor of the Arctic Ocean, beyond the 200 miles. And the question is, who owns those resources? And under the Law of the Sea Convention, what countries are able to do is, if they can prove that their coastline coming from, their shoreline, if that coastline extends out further into the Arctic Ocean than 200 nautical miles, they can claim, it's called an extended territorial shelf well beyond 200 miles. And the Russians were the first ones to play in this game in a kind of a comical way about 20, 25 years ago. They sent a submersible sub, out to the North Pole, and it went down, down to the floor, and they planted a Russian flag. And they claimed that this is just like, 500 years ago, Ponte de Leon, claiming, well, it was laughed off, it just said, this is not the case anymore. But under the Law of the Sea Convention, any of the coastal countries is allowed, to make a claim, and has to be based on science, that their coastal shelf goes beyond 200 nautical miles. What is going to happen ultimately, as I understand it, is those claims are going to be looked at by a body created under the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, and that body, will make decisions on who owns what. They will not be binding, because the countries, will then have to negotiate. As I kept, I said, these are not binding, provisions. But Russia, Norway, Denmark, Canada, they have all put claims in, for extended territorial shelf. You notice I say we have not. The United States has not. That is because we are not a formal party to the Law of the Sea Convention. Even though every president since Ronald Reagan, every chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, every commercial organization in the United States, all want us to become members of the UNCLOS, because that is the only way, that companies are going to be safe and field drill, that they can drill, and that their claim, for ownership of that area, is protected under UNCLOS. As I said, we are not members of it. We respect the treaty, in practice, but we cannot make, that formal claim, under the Law of the Sea Convention. The concern is, at some point, and now obviously this is a greater concern, is that Russia may not abide, by what the UNCLOS Commission agrees to. In other words, if they don't get all the way out to the North Pole, as they claim, that they may just resort to non-peaceful means, to enforce that. Until now, every country, has said, we want to solve all these issues peacefully, diplomatically. As I said, this was all before, Ukraine, that we are all committed to peaceful resolution of these issues. Now, the Russians, as I've said, have now resubmitted, a claim which is much stronger and much more heavily based on scientific data. And my guess is that it's going to take, still another year or two for this issue, to be finally decided. And this is a good point, to interject that for the Russians, the Arctic and the far north is absolutely critical to them. I always love to talk about the Arctic before audiences and say, why are we an Arctic country? Why are we an Arctic interested in the Arctic? People shake their heads. Ever heard of Alaska? Oh, yes. But for the Arctic, the Russia is absolutely critical in both spheres, that I've talked about. Much of their oil and gas, is up in the Arctic. That is where they are exporting, huge amounts of oil and gas right now. There are diamonds, there's timber up there. And for the Russians, the far north, the Arctic is really key to their future economic development. It's also very important to them militarily. They have a 4,000-mile Arctic Ocean coastline, which is 53% of the whole Arctic Ocean coastline. Why it's incredibly significant to them is if you look at a map, something called the Barents Sea. The Barents Sea connects the Arctic Ocean with the Atlantic. And the Russians, there's an area, sort of the western part of the Russian Arctic called the Kola Peninsula. And that is where the Russians have their fleet, their North Sea fleet berthed. And it's where they also have their submarine bases. That is where their second strike, their retaliation strike, is located. Which means that is their major, deterrent to a first strike by the United States or anybody else. So for the Russians, the defense of the Kola Peninsula and the north, is absolutely critical. And also, with this 4,000-mile coastline with ice melting, they're also worried about their border becoming more impervious as time goes on. Another thing, as I mentioned, though, that has happened is that these two maritime routes have somewhat opened up. The Northwest Passage, the one above Canada, is of less commercial interest. It's still icebound and it is not as easily navigable. The one above Russia, though, called the Northern Sea Route, is navigable. And that also, I'll be talking about that more, that also enters into the defense position, that the Russians, want to zealously, protect up in the Arctic. What we saw, though, as you go into the 2000s, years of the 2000s, the overall atmosphere geopolitically, begins to change. The Russians, I think with Putin, as time went on, it became a much more difficult relationship. I'm not going to go into all the reasons for it, but simply that the ideas, these sort of somewhat naive ideas we had about a sort of a halcyon period of peace, the end of history, as one famous analyst wrote, that Europe was going to be peaceful, capitalist, democratic, and that was the end of history now that the Cold War was over. Well, it did not work that way. And I would sort of give you a couple of data points where it became more obvious. One was the Russian war with Georgia in 2008. That was the first instance in which Russia had used force anywhere, in the former Soviet Union, with a neighboring country. And that, I think, marked, a time when Putin's very strong opposition to NATO, his complaints about US hegemony, that we were trying to run the world, that we were rubbing the Russians' noses, in the dirt, having lost the Cold War, and that, we were just simply taking advantage of them. And what we began to see, 2008, 2010, in those years, is the Russians starting a military buildup in the Arctic. And what they started with was refurbishing, old Soviet bases, that had been just left to rot, if you will. Russia, don't forget, in the 1990s was a rather poor country. The economy was very bad. By the early 2000s, they were beginning to recover. Oil and gas was going up in price, and they were able to begin to sort of get back on their feet economically. So they had the wherewithal, which they did not have before, to pursue this military buildup. And what we saw, as I said, was the refurbishing of Soviet bases. They established a new Arctic military command. They built new bases. They put new radars and equipment in. They put more troops up in the north. And we began to see sort of more maneuvers, more exercises, and also some pretty dangerous air incidents in the air, off, over the Arctic Ocean. And the Russians were arguing that all of what they were doing was defensive, that it was NATO, the United States, that had, revanchist aims against Russia, that we were interested in seizing this vast amount of oil and gas, in the Arctic. And that really began a debate in the United States about what were the Russians, really up to. We all accepted the fact that they had legitimate defensive concerns there, but was this going beyond? They were putting advanced radars, in the Arctic area, and there were concerns that what they were trying to do was to somehow or another disable our ability, to operate, in the Barents Sea, that if there were a nuclear war, that they had now, tried to checkmate us in certain ways by preventing our fleet and our Navy from doing what they could have done, in the Arctic. So that became a very, significant subject, for discussion. We, though, did not simply roll over and play dead. We also increased exercises. We talked about building new icebreakers, which we did not have. We also talked about building deep sea ports in Alaska, because we don't have a deep sea port, up there. The next significant date is Ukraine, and this is where Ukraine really comes into play. If you remember, 2014 is when the Russians annexed Crimea, and they also began to support the separatist wars in eastern Ukraine. We reacted, along with allies, in a variety of economic sanctions, but the one that I want to really emphasize is that we now prohibited US firms from participating in and assisting in the development of Arctic oil, Russian oil and gas resources in the Arctic. And that really, the Ukraine war in 2014 really signaled a real, the beginning of the curtain, coming down on the idea of keeping the Arctic, completely out of the broader, geopolitical concerns, between the United States and Russia. While this was going on, however, I have to emphasize the Arctic Council was still doing an awful lot of good scientific and environmental work. That was going on almost completely unaffected, by these broader, geopolitical, developments. And what we were seeing also was an evolution in the Arctic Council to make it more adaptable, to deal more with the key issues that climate change, was presenting in the Arctic. And there were 3 agreements that were negotiated under Arctic Council auspices, which really were very important. The first one dealt with the handling of oil spills. And if you remember, in Alaska, there was a terrible, the Valdez, I forgot what it was called, the Valdez Express or something, the ship that sunk. Terrible, terrible pollution, accident, in the Arctic. And it was recognized, that the Arctic countries needed to come together, to deal with another oil spill if it should happen again. And keep in mind, that the Arctic, is not the Potomac River or the Colorado River. There are no Coast Guard stations, in the Arctic Ocean. And the real concern, in addition to an oil spill, was that as the Arctic was beginning to open up, with warmer temperatures, and we began to see tourist boats going up there, that a tourist boat might sink. No Coast Guard stations up there. So the agreement was, on search and rescue, that was the second one, sort of dividing up the Arctic so that if there were a terrible tragedy, maritime tragedy, that a country, that was closest by would be, alerted and would go to try to, to rescue people and do what was necessary. Another thing that was done was a binding agreement on scientific cooperation for the next 5 years. I think that was signed in about 2018 or 19. So I think that agreement, is still extant. But the key thing with all of these 3 agreements is that they were made binding. All countries agreed to be bound by them. And that meant that the Arctic Council, had evolved into a place where binding agreements could now be taken. There were a couple of other agreements that I just briefly want to mention that showed, that there was still lots of excellent cooperation going on. There was an agreement negotiated basically under US auspices, which literally froze fishing in the high Arctic Ocean. In other words, no fishing. And that was because we needed to do scientific research on the impact of global warming and the fish stocks moving around before fishing, could be allowed, in the high Arctic Ocean. And that, has, been, brought into effect. And the other thing that happened was the International Maritime Organization, IMO, agreed an agreement, it was called the Polar Code. And the point of that was to make sure that vessels that were now going up into the Arctic were prepared for it, because this terrible worry that we had that, there'd be some, cruise boat that would just go up there, hit some ice, sink, losing 200 people. And so the Polar Code, now regulates, boats that, go on to the Arctic Ocean to make sure, that their hulls, that are reinforced and that they are actually capable, of what is, of actually operating up there. Now, this was the period also, let's see if I can get myself back here. Yeah, this was the period also that we began to see more interest in the Arctic. And what we also began to see was a lot of exaggeration, that wars were inevitable in the Arctic because of all the oil and gas there, that countries were going to be fighting over who owned what, that the Russian military buildup inevitably meant, we were going to have a conflict there, that the Chinese were getting more involved, which I'll talk about that in a moment. They were getting involved. And the neo-realists, the people who, sort of look at the world in a Hobbesian way, they were arguing, that war was imminent, that war was inevitable, up in the Arctic. A number of us were arguing, look, we still don't know if what the Russians and others are doing is defensive. The Arctic Council is working beautifully. There are no arguments over who owns what because of the Law of the Sea Convention, and that, guys and gals, cool your jets. This is not really, the way it is being, presented. And our militaries all developed, each branch of our militaries, developed Arctic strategies, all of which took cognizance of the military buildup, but said that despite this, that the likelihood of conflict, in the Arctic was low, and I emphasize low likelihood. What was of most concern was to our Navy, and they were concerned that both Canada and Russia were declaring these northern sea routes as internal waterways. And that was a particular concern with the northern sea route, the Russian route, because, as I said, there is more traffic there, and the Russians were demanding payment, and they were demanding, that Russian pilots be aboard any ship, going through the northern sea route. That, of course, is anathema to the U.S. Navy. And that remains an issue. It is not an issue we're going to go to war over, but it is an issue, what was of concern. The sort of formal move into stage 2 in the Arctic, the area that I call cooperation and competition, really was signaled under the last presidential administration, under the Trump administration. And if you recall, as a result of the worsening relationship, with Russia, things that were going on in Ukraine, in Syria, in Libya, Afghanistan, that the United States, we made the decision that counterterrorism was no longer the principal security threat, and that the major threat now was a competition, great power competition with Russia, and China. And this was brought home in the Arctic Council when then Secretary of State Pompeo appeared at an Arctic Council meeting, and for the first time in the history of the Arctic Council, really brought hard security issues into the Arctic Council. He was very strong on saying that the Arctic Council is now a zone of great power competition between the US, China, and Russia, and that, that we were going to have to prepare, for this type, of competition in the future. This was a shock, I can tell you, to the scientists and all those working in the Arctic Council, who have been working for years and years and years, to keep the Arctic Council out of the broader, geopolitical situation. Even then, despite this, the scientific, cooperation, was going on. While this was going on, though, I would just have to say that the ideas about developing Arctic oil and gas, some of that, began to fall away. The costs of that are very expensive. It is cheaper as a result of fracking and other sources now, to develop oil and gas in other places. The Russians are still going ahead full steam, but there are lots of American companies who are sort of pulling back out of Alaska and other places because it's simply more cost-effective and easier, to develop elsewhere. The sea routes, I just want to mention too, the use of the northern sea route is going up, but this has not been the bonanza. This has not been what the Russians, were predicting. And that is the Arctic Ocean, even though, the ice is melting, is still a dangerous place for shipping, even in the summertime. There are still icebergs, that are floating. A lot of the Arctic Ocean, is uncharted. And what we're seeing, in the Arctic Ocean, the Northern Sea Route, the Russian route right now, is that it's mostly destinational cargoes. In other words, it's oil and gas coming from, Russian sources going to China. You're not seeing container ships. You're not seeing other kinds of shipping that much, mainly because it is still dangerous and also because the maritime business really depends on set schedules. And if you're a shipper, a container shipper, you cannot be guaranteed that you're going to not hit, a big storm in the Arctic, in the summertime. And you cannot guarantee, delivery on a certain day, which makes insurance costs, much, much higher. And as I said, it is not proven to be, the bonanza that the Russians, were hoping for. And as I say, the Canadians say the same thing, that these are internal waterways. So what we had, at the end of the Trump administration was a lot more heated rhetoric. But in the realities of the situation, it was not, quite as bad as it looked. That changed. President Biden came in, and if you recall, he made climate change a very significant part of his presidency, unlike Trump, who had, decried it, denied it, and really did very, very little about it. But Biden came in and, appointed John Kerry, former Secretary of State, as our climate coordinator. We went back to the Paris Climate Accords on climate change. We were really trying, to put our money, where our mouth is. The Russians, interestingly enough, last year also became chair of the Arctic Council. It's a 2-year term, and they became, chair of the Arctic Council. One quick word about the Russians' involvement in climate change. Russia is one of the countries where the impact is going to be both positive and negative. The negative is they are a major oil and gas exporter. They are dependent on oil and gas export revenues for their budget. And as the world moves away, from oil and gas, hopefully, it's going to impact them very, very, very directly. The methane that I talked about is already impacting, the Russian Arctic. But if the weather warms, some of the Russian lands, which are now, non-fertile, may become, agriculturally sustaining. So the Russians under Putin have been fairly ambivalent, about climate change. They have not played, in the way that they should. Some of it is simply Putin. Putin, just focuses on major, geopolitical issues, and everything else kind of goes by the board. And unless he gets interested, nothing much, is going to happen. Now, the key thing, and I'm going to finish with this, is what happened on February 24th. that was the day that Russia invaded Ukraine. And this has had a direct and very negative impact in the Arctic. Immediately after that happened, the 7 other countries in the Arctic Council all suspended activity, in the Arctic Council. They refused to continue cooperating, with Russia in the Arctic Council. The argument was that Russia as chair was going to use the chairmanship, the bully pulpit of the Arctic Council, to spread their lies and propaganda about who was at fault, in the Ukraine. And that meant, that we were simply not going to work with them any longer. What that means is a big question mark. I've been talking to people at the State Department. Nobody knows how long the suspension, is going to last. What is happening now is that we are working with these 7 other countries to basically continue a lot of the, scientific, the environmental work amongst, the 7 of us. And that will go on a bilateral and multilateral basis. And there are also other environmental groups, that work up in the Arctic, and the idea, they're mostly regional groups, Nordic countries, that we would work, with them as well. One thing that we're watching very, very closely is whether the Russians are going to do any new military tactics or changes in the Arctic. So far, what we've been able to see is they seem to have moved some troops to Ukraine from the Kola Peninsula. And the Norwegians, who we've spoken with, they do not see any new Russian military steps, and they don't anticipate, anything right now. So at least on the military side of things, the Arctic has not, moved from, the great concerns that we had, a couple of years ago, to a real crisis flag, akin to what's going on, in Ukraine. There are interesting things going on. Finland and Sweden, as you may know, are now much more serious about joining NATO. NATO is much more engaged in studying the Arctic and doing things militarily in the Arctic. What Putin has done, with his invasion of Ukraine, has made all of his greatest fears about, NATO and other countries joining NATO and standing against Russia come true because of what he has done, in Ukraine. The work on climate change goes on. This I want to close with. There's just been, there was the big climate meeting in Scotland in December. Goals on reducing global warming, have been issued. But the latest experts report, which just came out from the UN expert group studying climate change, is that the rate of global warming is increasing, that the goals that we set, are probably going to be surpassed by global warming by the end of this decade. There were dire prospects, but they also said that the situation was not, totally lost. That there are all kinds of alternative, forms of fuel, renewables, electricity, etc. And that cost for these things, will go down, the more we use them. And their challenge was to all governments, in the world right now, it's going to be expensive, but it is really up to you. There is still time, but you're going to have to do something about it. So that's where we are right now. Lots of questions about how seriously we're going to confront climate change, and lots of questions about what kind of cooperation we're going to have, in the Arctic. But no question, that climate change is an existential crisis, and that if we don't pay attention to it, we're going to pay for it, and our children and grandchildren will pay for it. So let me finish there, and I'll be glad to take any questions.